Welcome to the 15th in the series of shiurim on the Yud Gimel Ikkarim of the Rambam. That is the 13 principles of Maimonides, the 13 principles of faith. And we find that we're up to the Yesod HaSiri, the 10th principle. So I'm now going to read, once again, from the Shilat edition, the direct translation from the Arabic, which appears on Daf Kuf Mem Hey, page Kuf Mem Hey. HaYesod HaSiri. Shehu Yis'ala Yedea Ma'aseh Bnei Adam. The Kadosh Baruch Hu knows the acts of man. Ve'eino Maznicham. In other words, he doesn't ignore them. Not only does he know them, he doesn't ignore them. V'lo kedas Misha Omar, and not like the opinion of he who says, Ozav Hashem es ha'oretz, that God has abandoned the world, the terrestrial world. Ela kamosha Omar, like it says in the pasuk of Yirmiyahu, Gedola Eitzav Rav Alila Asher Necha Fekuchos Al Kol Darchei Bnei Adam. There in Yirmiyahu it says explicitly that your eyes are open to see all the ways of men. For Omar, and then the Rambam brings another pasuk from Bereshis. Vayar Hashem, God saw Ki Rabba Ras Ha'adam Ba'oretz. God saw that there was much evil of men on earth. For Omar, and third pasuk the Rambam brings Zakas Doim V'Amoire Ki Rabba. The cry coming from Sdom Amor was very much. V'zeh Yera Al Zeh Yesod HaSiri. And these are psukim, these are verses which come to, which give testimony or which express this Yesod HaSiri. Okay, first of all, what is the background that the Rambam is speaking about? So the background, which is actually in a certain sense not like we sent out for the Mara Mekaimes, as usually we got it wrong. But in any case, the Rambam speaks about this in Perek Yud Zayin and Chelik Shlishi. That's chapter 17 of the chapter 17 of the third volume of the Moreh Nevuchim. And the Rambam actually there is not speaking so much about Yediyah, God's knowledge, but is actually speaking about Hashgacha, which is providence. Interestingly enough is he really devotes the chapters 20 and 21 to God's knowledge. But in chapter 17 he devotes to providence, but in any case, providence and knowledge are actually somehow connected, as we'll see in a little while. Now, the Rambam begins chapter 17 by saying that he's going to present 5 opinions on providence. The first opinion is that there's no providence whatsoever on anything, and the Rambam understands that to that's apikarsis. I think that's the most prevalent opinion today in the world. Hadeya Shniya. The second opinion, I'm once reading in from the Schwartz edition on page 474. Once again, Perek Yud Zayin Chelik Shlishi of the Moreh Nevuchim of the God from Perplex, chapter 17, section 3. And I'm reading from page 474, the last paragraph. Hadas Hashni, who daitel Shemish Soiver, the opinion of he who is of the opinion. Now, this person is going to be Aristotle. And at the very, very end of presenting this opinion, the Rambam ends with the pasuk, Ozav Hashem es ha'oretz. That appears at the very end of page 475. So therefore, this should not surprise anybody. I've got the right Maramokar. Right? Aristotle says on certain things there is providence. And these are directed by a person who, right, these are directed by someone who is Mesader, who arranges them, who designs them. In other words, this is designed. But part of the world is left to mikra, to coincidence. This is the opinion of Aristotle. So I'm going to summarize what does Aristotle say about Hashgacha, about providence. Who's soiver? So Aristotle's the opinion. Kadosh Baruch Hu looks after, is mashkiach, places his providence ala galgalim. He's on the spheres. Galmasha b'seicham. And therefore, all the details of the Galgalim, all the details of the spheres, move in accordance as we see they are. And he brings Alexander, who says that the providence of Kadosh Baruch Hu ends by the moon. Right now, and that's what he says. Right. Then he goes, okay, so he says like this. Now, regarding what about other things that are below the moon? In other words, that would be the terrestrial world. In other words, here we're speaking about the Yareach, which is the celestial world. Okay? Now, he says, now, regarding the species, and including terrestrial species, it's not completely ignored. In other words, we can't say there's absolutely no hashgacha, no providence. Because we see that, for example, species are nurtured, and we see that there's a design for species that they're able to get, they're able to be nurtured and they have the right sustenance, right? And it's given, and they're given the koach, the power to move. The Ram explains. So in other words, basically, and all of these things are necessary for the preservation of the species. In other words, there's something what you would call, in the modern hashkafa language, hashkacha klolis. There's a general providence on each species to maintain that species. Okay? But says the Rambam, but the details, in other words, the individual members of a species, their movements are purely random. In other words, there's no designer, there's no divine design on the specific members of a species. L'mashal, for example, says the Rambam, right, when there's a stormy wind, who believes Safik Tapil Kama Olam Eitz Echa. In other words, a wind will certainly cause the branches or the leaves of certain trees to fall. Tishpa Olav Shal Eitz Acher will break the branch of another tree. Tapil Evim Me'ezah Shal Get Avonim, it'll blow off a stone from a stone fence, stone wall. Tala Ofal Esav Kolshu, or will kick up some dust. But Tashkas Oisav Tasal as Gali Amayim Besvina Shem Shitov. What could possibly be that will make a tsunami, right? It'll make a hurricane on the water and will, in fact, actually sink the boat. The Chol Mishabah or Chelkam Yitbu, and people in the ship will die. According to Aristotle, there's no distinction between the falling of the leaf, which Hakadosh Baruch Hu couldn't care less with, right? Where there's no hashgacha, no providence, and between the drowning of people in the ship. Aristotle does not distinguish between an animal whose feces, whose excrement goes on ants or meso and they die. For example, a building is filled with people who are praying and the building collapses and kills them. Okay? Besikum. In other words, to summarize the opinion of Aristotle, things that move in a very regular, monotonous, mathematical motion, like the galgalim, like the spheres, right? So therefore we can say there's a hashgacha. Hashgacha lokis mislav elav. So therefore there's divine providence. But for example, things that we see don't have a regular mathematical movement, like all the different types of plants, the individual plants, animals and man, this is purely coincidence. This is purely random. And has nothing to do, and certainly there's no designer, there's no manik, there's no person who's directing their movement. There's no divine providence. Etc. And amanim b'dei zois, those who believe in this opinion, af mi bein hamordim b'terasenu, heim oimim, they're the ones who say, Ozav Hashem es ha'oretz. So in other words, the opinion of Aristotle is that divine providence is only on celestial objects which move in a periodic, and a continuous, and a non-ceasing mathematical motion. But for example, cats, people, leaves, which don't have a mathematical motion to them, there's absolutely no providence. That's the opinion of Aristotle. So comes the Rambam and says, God knows the acts of man. I'm going back now to the Ikkarim, to the 10th Ikkar, right? And not like the opinion of his Asher v'Sa'aretz, El K'mo She'amar, Godol ha'etzav v'alila, Asher necha pekuchas b'nei Adam, etc., etc. Now, the question is, what is the opinion of the Rambam? The opinion of the Rambam, which he goes on, which is he brings the Dei HaChamishis, right, is the opinion that, in fact, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, he speaks first about Hashgacha, and that the Rambam says, the Rambam says, wait a second. On page 480, the Rambam actually says like this. This is 480 in the chapter 17 of the third section of the guide, page 480 in the Schwartz edition, the last paragraph, third paragraph, right? So he says, I'm going to summarize to you what is divine providence. Right? Okay. Right? This is the sheet of the Torah, Sifra Shalakel, Sifra Nevi'enu. This is the Chumash and the books of the Nevi'im and the prophets. It says around this is the best of all opinions, and the closest and the most rational. Says the Rambam, I believe that the divine providence in this terrestrial world, underneath the moon, it's only on man. In other words, it's only man, right, who's commanded in evil, good and evil. So therefore you could say kol duach habishmat. Avol shabalechai, animals, kol shkanat tzmachim, blossom and plants, daiti aleim kedas aristo. My opinion is the opinion of Aristotle. I don't believe that this leaf fell down because the Kadosh Baruch Hu said fall down. I don't believe that this spider ate this fly by divine will. So in other words, what the Rambam is saying is that his opinion is the same opinion as that of Aristotle, with one exception, man. With one exception, man. Now, the fact is that this is clear in the 10th principle, because the Rambam says, he knows the actions of man. Right? And he doesn't abandon them. So Aristotle believed that there isn't a divine providence even in the terrestrial world, even on man. Because man, of course, some people do maybe, certainly computers. Those people do computers like people, but I'm saying is most people don't act in a perfect mathematical fashion. Okay? But rather Rambam brings opinions. But in fact, what it would appear to be is that the opinion of the Rambam here is identical with that of Aristotle, with regard to God's knowledge, right? Except that the Rambam understands that God knows the actions of man. Now, we have to there's certain things here, in other words, this is clearly the Rambam studying a shiur. Now, the thing is like this, which is important, is that we have to discuss the relationship between God's knowledge and God's providence. Now, Aristotle, the Rambam in chapter 17 doesn't really directly,
speaks so much about God's knowledge. His language here is really on hashkacha or masader. In other words, when he speaks about, right? In other words, when he speaks about the when actually he invokes Aristotle, right? He speaks about God is not mashkiach. In other words, does not have providence on the terrestrial world, only on celestial objects, which one, in a certain sense, could claim that here providence and knowledge are one and the same thing, because if God has knowledge on something, why wouldn't he have hashkacha on it? In other words, it would seem from reading in Perek Yud Zayin that even though the Rambam here speaks about hashkacha, which is providence, right? He's not speaking about Yediyah, God's knowledge. Nonetheless, I mean, one could say clearly that one could use providence and knowledge interchangeably. In other words, that God, in fact, actually has knowledge up to the moon, and below the moon, the terrestrial world, there's no knowledge of God, except for that of man. One could have said that, and that certainly would fit into the language of the 10th principle. Well, notice in the 10th principle, the Rambam is not speaking about, doesn't use, if Shalat's translation is accurate, which we're relying upon it, he's not translating it as hashkacha, providence. He's translating it as yediyah, knowledge. So it would seem that if we equate knowledge and providence, right, in this way, then in fact God's knowledge is only of objects which are, in chapter 7, which are celestial, and they have knowledge of man. And that's what Shalat is doing. Except the fact is that it's not all clear that this is really true. This is what I want to discuss. It seems to be in the Rambam, and there's certain suggestions in the Rambam, that in fact actually God's knowledge is in fact on all objects. The Rambam actually says this in the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam says in Perek Beis Halacha Tes, right, in Yesodiyat Torah, right, the Rambam says, Kol nimtzayim, chutz min haboire, b'tzuri shoyne ad yitush katan, shu b'tibo oretz, everything that exists outside of the Creator, from either the tzuri shoyne, the highest tzur, which means the highest sphere, the highest idea, ad yitush katan shu b'tibo oretz, until a small fly in the middle of the earth, hakol mikoyach amisui nimtzo, all comes from the truth of, comes from God, from God's truth, from God's creation. But since God knows and is aware of His greatness and His truth, He knows everything. So it would appear from Halacha Tes that in fact the Rambam seems to be saying that in fact actually God knows everything. Since He created everything, He knows everything. And that would include the Yitush HaKatan, the small fly. Now, in the Moreh Nevuchim, in Perek Chav, the Rambam speaks about God's knowledge, and right, and he goes in detail, which we'll speak about Mitzvah Shem a little bit later on, the differences between God's knowledge and man's knowledge. But the Rambam says clearly, right? The Rambam says clearly that here that this is in Perek Chav, in Chelik Gimel, chapter 20 of section 3. Okay. The Rambam says he speaks about God's knowledge. And the Hetem, I'm now page 489 so he says, God, let me begin from the beginning of the paragraph, in the chapter. There can't be any new knowledge in God. In other words, God cannot know at any point something He didn't know before that. Okay? They can know a lot of knowledges, right? And then he says, in other words, it can't be that God knows something new about something. Right? Okay? That's what he says. Now, in accordance with this, on page 489, second paragraph, the God's knowledge has to be infinite. God can know everything. His knowledge is totally infinite. Okay, now. Right? Now, he says, some people, some from the Balei Iyun, some thinkers, have asserted the axiom that knowledge relates to min, which means a species, and extends to all the details, all the individual members of that species. This is the opinion of every Ben Torah. And this is a necessary consequence of thought. However, he says the philosophers disagree. Right? The philosophers disagree, and that God's knowledge, right, is not infinite, etc., etc. In other words, what the Rambam is saying in chapter 20, that in fact, God's knowledge, and he calls this the das of every Ben Torah, that in fact God's knowledge extends not only from the general principles of a species, but to every individual part of a species. Whereas the philosophers don't agree. According to the Rambam, God's knowledge is infinite, but philosophers is not so much, not so infinite. So, in other words, what we find here is a very interesting thing. In other words, in Aristotle, providence, as far as philosophy is concerned, providence and knowledge are the same thing. Hainu ha, they're equated. According to Aristotle, God has no knowledge of individual members of a species in the terrestrial world. There's no knowledge whatsoever. They're purely random. And consequently, of course, there can't be any hashgacha. There can't be any providence. If God doesn't know about something, so he's not mashgiach on something. But God, there is what's called a hashgacha klolis, a providence of the species. God knows the rules of nature. He doesn't know individual species. Now, Maimonides, the Rambam, says that his opinion on hashgacha, on providence, was identical with that of Aristotle, except with the exception of man. Because man has intellect, whatever. However, it's clear that there's another important distinction between the Rambam and Aristotle regarding knowledge. According to the Rambam, God's knowledge is infinite and extends not only to the general rules of nature of the terrestrial world, but also extends to all Pirtei Hamin, the individual members. So this very, very much is in accordance with what he says in the Mishnah Torah. And I read you in Paraktes, Kol nimtzoim chutz b'laboyim mitzvah rishona af yetush koton hakol mikoyach amisei nimtzo. They all come from God's truth, from the power of God's truth. Ulefishu yadei atzmoi, since God knows Himself, u'marke gadol v'sefartoi, He knows His greatness and His glory, v'amitoi, and His truth. U'yadei hakol, He knows everything. Everything meaning even the yetush koton b'tobo ha'oretz, even the small small ant in the middle of the earth. So we see over here, and the interesting thing is that, and this comes out in the Moreh Nevuchim. Interesting enough is that the Rambam presents hashgacha, providence, in chapter 17, and only speaks about hashgacha. In chapter 20 and 21, he speaks about God's yediyah, God's knowledge.
What does hashgacha mean?
Wait. We're going to say that in a little while. Whereas, however, the interesting thing is, in Yesod HaAsiri, in the 10th, he speaks about God's knowledge, and if you're medayik, if you read, you have to read so carefully, not as carefully as we read the Paraches and you say the Rambam, but we read it semi-carefully. The Rambam just says, he knows the acts of man, meaning that what? The acts of other traditional beings, he doesn't know in accordance with Aristotle, which in fact actually he is clearly arguing on that in the guide. Now, what does hashgacha mean? So basically, hashgacha means that God is... Hashgacha basically means that God, not only does God know your acts, but of course with your acts God will punish or reward you. That's what hashgacha is. In other words, hashgacha, providence for the Rambam is God will react to your acts.
In this world.
In this world, right. We're speaking about this world. That's what's called hashgacha. God will punish you, reward you. Now, the Rambam lists, of course, 5 opinions of providence. Sometimes, according to some opinions, God will punish you even though you didn't deserve it. The Rambam holds that that's ridiculous, that's absurd. And that's actually what we're going to speak about in Mitzvah Hashem in Yisod HaChalasa, the 11th principle. But right now, we're speaking about the concept of Yediyah. But the question is, that the question I would like to raise is that, in other words, the Rambam limits himself in Yisod HaSiri to God's Yediyah. Now, if Yisod HaSiri, the 10th principle, comes together with Yisod HaChalasa, so really, in fact, you could say that when it says Yediyah, God really means Yediyah with a hashgacha, and the hashgacha is in the 11th principle. In other words, you could say that when Rambam says Yediyah, it's lav dafka, no daf Yediyah. No, the Ikkarim is hashgacha. Whereas the Rambam, the 10th principle, is come just by the 11th principle, like we saw in some of the principles too. The earlier principles are just building up to the later principles, the latter principles.
Just in terms of intent, but
right.
Different to say.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Right. Omniscience is different.
Right. Right. But the fact is, though, is that clearly, I would say, I mean, it's clearly this is in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the guide, and in the Yisod HaTorah, God has knowledge of everything, every detail. Now, I want to go into this a little bit further because I think this is an important thing. The concept of Yediyah is very, very important for the Rambam. God's knowledge too. What do we mean by God's knowledge? Now we're speaking God's knowledge. Because everybody is all aware of the fact that a famous contradiction which the Rambam speaks about, I don't know where most people encounter it. I would imagine most people encounter it in Hilchos Tshuva, in Parakeh, in the Hilchos Tshuva Parakeh in Halacha Hey, the famous conflict, or still a contradiction, between God's knowledge and man's free will. Okay? And the Rambam speaks about this in several places. He speaks about this in the in Shemot HaPakim. This is all over the Rambam. It's interesting that he speaks about this a little bit in the Moreh Nevuchim too, but not really directly. Not really directly. Okay? But, in any case, let me go through a little bit through in Hilchos Tshuva what the Rambam says, and then I want to compare this to actually to the Moreh Nevuchim, what he says in Yisod HaTorah. Okay? In Hilchos Tshuva, Parakeh, Parakeh, Halacha Hey, Parakeh, Hilchos Tshuva, Halacha Hey, it's right in the middle. After the Rambam is established in the first 4 halachas that man has absolute free will, which we've spoken about too. We've spoken about that in the earlier, right? That's create b'yesh b'ayin, correction ex nihilo. Shemet toimev ala Kodesh Baruch Hu yodea kol ma shaya kodem sheyeh. Kodesh Baruch Hu knows everything before it happened. Yada she's a tzaddik or rasha or lo yada. Right? He knows that Kodesh Baruch Hu knows this people be a tzaddik or rasha. Im yodea shu yeh tzaddik or rasha shu yeh tzaddik. V'im tamesh yodea shu yeh tzaddik if she yeh rasha reis lo yada davar dos. You have to say that Kodesh Baruch Hu knows the person to be a tzaddik or rasha. However, if that's true, there can't be free will. Right? Right? Even though she gets tzaddik, the person knows it's going to be a tzaddik. If she should get tzaddik, it can't be that it can't be a tzaddik, because Baruch knows everything. If a shiur Russia, if a Kodesh Baruch Hu knows it's going to be a tzaddik, the person comes out of Russia, then doesn't know. The A, you should know, Shetshuva, She'ela Zu, Ahucha Me'eretz, Midu Rechov B'nayam. I don't know. Speaks about this. V'kaba Ikkarim Gedolim, V'harorim, Ramim Tluyim Bo, many Ikkarim that are totally on this. Interesting, what Ikkarim are totally on this? I want to say, what's Kama Ikkarim? Well, first of all, I want to claim, you say Asiri, the 10th principle. You say Acharasa, Schav Oynish, and you say Avi, Riesh Mi'ayin. Those are at least 3 Ikkarim. In fact, I want to say even more so. I want to say actually, right? Yichudai. We're going to see God's knowledge. Yichudai, maybe Yichudai. We're going to see that Rambam's going to identify God's knowledge with God's essence. So we have, in my opinion, at least 4 Ikkarim that are contingent upon this. The answer. So he says, we've already explained in the 2nd chapter of Sirei HaTorah, Kodesh Baruch Hu does not know with a knowledge that is different from him, like a man whose knowledge, person's knowledge and identity are 2 separate things. Kodesh Baruch Hu is one with his knowledge. No one could understand what this knowledge is. In other words, that there's a knowledge that identical with something. Just like one cannot know the truth of a Kodesh Baruch Hu. This is the Rambam's negative theology. So a person can understand God's knowledge. Okay? The Kavan, says the Rambam, Shekain, who ain't by no koich like that. We can't know how Kodesh Baruch Hu knows something. אבל לא ידע ולסוף שמיים סבי האדם אין הקדוש ברוך הוא מוישה ולא גוז עליו ולא עשה כך ולא שלס כך ולא מבני קבוס הדס אלא ברייס ברוס בדברי החוכם וזה נאמר מנבואה שדנס האדם כמייסה. In other words, basically, says the Rambam, we don't, but we know certainly that a person's acts are up to him. The Kadosh Baruch Hu cannot decree upon him, right? And says the Rambam, this is not only religious, but also this is rational too. Now, what the Rambam appears to be saying is that there's no question. The question doesn't exist. The contradiction doesn't exist. Why? Because the contradiction only exists assuming that there's something called God's knowledge. But we don't know what God's knowledge is. We can't speak about God's knowledge just like we can't speak about God himself. So basically the Rambam says, since we don't have any idea what it means to say God knows, so therefore the question is nonsensical. It's not a very Wittgensteinian answer. Right? That's what the Rambam says. In other words, it's a very difficult answer. The Rambam says we can't ask the question because the terms are not understood. The terms are hidden from us. We can't see what it means for God to know. You know, if God knows, then there's a contradiction. Because knowledge means knowing something in the future. And of course, knowing something in the future means kind of free will. But the word God knows has as much meaning as knowing God himself. And therefore, no contradiction yet. What do you want to say?
Didn't we say that the difference between man knowing something and God knowing
We'll speak about that in a little while. That's chapter 68, section 1. I know your contradiction. I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. Okay, now. But it's the biggest deal than that, okay, John? Okay, now. By the way, it's a difficult answer. It's such a difficult answer that the Triebitz says.
Yeah, why ask questions?
No, the Triebitz is a question. He says, the Rambam says, you're not being clever, you're not being smart. He says, why? You ask the question, you give an answer, and everyone can understand.
I don't understand. I've never understood the right, but why can't he understand the answer? What's so hard about the answer?
ולא ידע שהשלימה והוא אחר בשאלת בקושה וניח דו בקושה. He answered a question, והחזיר לאמונה. It was better, right?
No, but it's not true. He gave an answer, which is the question is not a question. That's a good answer.
וטוב להניח לדבר בתמימוס התמימים, ולא יהיה להם ויניח דייתם בספק, ואולי שעה אחת יבוא here believe him על זה. In other words, you raise a question, before you say you understand the question, you answer. You raise a question, you don't give an answer, and you can't raise a question without giving an answer. And people are gonna go off the derech. So the Rabbi gives an answer. What's the Rabbi's answer? That a certain thing God knows, some things He doesn't know. Anyway, yeah. What do you think? What do you think his answer is? It's a very difficult answer. He didn't answer the question. What he did was he says you can't ask the question.
Why is that not an answer?
I don't know. If I raise a question and you say that you can't ask the question, does it mean that you answered the question? You didn't answer the question.
No, you demonstrate why the question is nonsensical, given the paradigm in which we think.
But that doesn't appear to be an answer to a question.
Okay.
It's like it's like the derech chinuch in many institutions today, right? That's not a question. You can't ask a question like that.
No, but
It's not
it logically undermines the question.
But that's a very
sophisticated.
that's very sophisticated. Most people understand that when you ask a question and you say, "Well, you really can't ask this question," then you're not really answering the question.
Now, if someone asks, "What's it written in the 6th book of the Chumash?" and you answer them, that's not a question because there is no 6th.
No, because you made a mistake. You made a mistake. You thought there were 5
saying the question's a mistake.
No. The question's a question. The Rambam himself asked the question.
But the question is based on an error.
No. You see, it's not like this. No, the question's not based on the error. The question is a question, except that what? We're using God's knowledge in a way, we're using God's knowledge in a way in which we understand, let's say, man knows something. But in fact, actually, God's knowledge is opaque and cannot be used in this way. However, I mean, not to go into detail really on the merits of the Rambam statement, but the fact is that what you've done is that we don't understand what God's knowledge is. You haven't said to me, well, that's not true, God doesn't know anything. You said we can't really speak about God's knowledge. We can't ask the question because God's knowledge is very difficult to understand. So in a certain sense, I haven't answered the question. In fact, you know what my answer has been? This question is too hard for me to understand. That's what I've said.
No, really, you're saying that by definition our minds
are too small. But what does that imply? I've raised a question and really I can't answer. See, I haven't said what's in the 6th Chumash. By the way, there's Shitas and Shabbos, so there is a 6th one. So don't Kuf Yud Zayid and Shabbos. But anyway, what I'm saying is, in other words, if he would have said your question is based on my mistake, he didn't say that. He said the question uses a term which we cannot fully understand, and therefore you can't answer the question. But the fact is that why can't I answer the question? Not because it's based upon a mistake, but because we can't understand it. So therefore, netto, right? I've raised the question. You can't really understand the answer to this question. So I haven't answered your question. Says the Ravid, you can say people to that, they'll fry out. The Ravid is not saying the Rambam is wrong. But the Ravid is saying is, Lo nog zeh machaba minach hachachamim. You weren't smart. You don't raise a question you can't answer. So therefore,
Except the
the Ravid gives, the Ravid gives a good cure of question, good cure of answer. In other words, that God knows things which operate naturally, but if something, will deviate from natural order, whatever it is, or something that's exceptional, God doesn't know that. Which means basically, the Ravid is basically completely contracted God's knowledge.
And he's now arguing on Rambam.
No.
He's saying, well,
Is he arguing on the Rambam? He's saying this is not the type of answer you have to present to people.
It seems like the Rambam's providence, like his hashgacha, that the things that God has providence on and not.
No. Yeah, that's true, but that could possibly. But that's here we're speaking about even. That's true too, but the fact is, though, is that even with people too, he doesn't have total providence.
And he's not limiting it to man either.
He's limited to man too, so it's not sure. But anyway, like this. Do you hear what I'm saying? In other words, the question uses terms that we really fully do not comprehend by hand. Therefore what? I can't answer you the question because we can understand it. Therefore what? I've raised a question and I haven't given you an answer. On the contrary, we don't understand it.
As Rabbi Triebitz suggesting the Rav doesn't really believe the answer he gives.
My opinion of the Ravid is that he agrees that this is probably the right answer, but he feels that this is not the answer you can give people because you're going to cause people to lose their emunah, and therefore he says there's a more practical answer to give to people. That's why I understand
So
that.
there's a cure to give the wrong answer.
Yes. Now I do believe, I'm sure I do believe in Tom Day gives a different answer, or says something different, which means this is the way I understand the Ravid. His attack on the Rambam is not that the Rambam's answer is wrong. The attack of the Ravid on the Rambam is very, very simple. You know, you can't, this is not the type of answer you can give to people. Now, the fact is, though, I said, what does the Rambam say in Perek Beis in Yesodei Torah about God's knowledge? And that's what I want to turn to. Okay? In Perek Beis, Halacha Yud, in Yesodei Torah, the Rambam says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu makir amisai v'yodeh oisai kamo she'id. God knows His truth, and knows it the way it is. Ve'en yodeh b'deh she'i chutz mimenu, kamo she'anu yodeh. Otherwise, the Rambam's knowledge is not separate from God. She'enu v'tah separate. In other words, we and our knowledge are two separate things. God's knowledge is at one with Him, the capital H. Aval ha'beireh hu v'daito v'chayev echad, b'kol tzad b'kol pina. In other words, God, the Creator, and His knowledge and His life are one from every aspect. Because what? Now, Nim says, okay, so in other words, God's knowledge and He are one. God's knowledge is separate. Okay? But then goes on the Rambam and says, and that's what the Rambam said in Perek A, in the Cheshuva. But then the Rambam says, Nibs is oiler. As a consequence of this, we say, Hu HaYodeya, He's the knower. Hu HaYadua, He's the object of knowledge. Hu Adei Atzman, He's the knowledge itself, all is one. V'davar zeh in koch b'feh la'amroi. No one can even possibly say this. No one can hear this. No one can understand this. Therefore we say, right, etc., etc. Enu makia, right? Enu makia buim v'yodim machpas abuim k'mo right? And machpas as v'yodom. Lefichach b'pnei sheyodeh as v'yodah hakol shekol nismach v'yosem lo. Okay? Because he doesn't know like we know. Now, so the Rambam says that God's knowledge are not separate things, and therefore we cannot understand this. But what's interesting, the Rambam does say, right? The Rambam does say that He is the knower, He's the object of knowledge, and He is knowledge itself, and all is one. In other words, part of this unity that the Rambam is claiming, God and one is knowledge, is the fact that the knower, the known, and the act of knowledge are all one and the same. What's interesting, and this is the question that you asked, is the Rambam says the same thing as about man. The Rambam says in chapter 68 of the guide, of section 1 of the guide, and he speaks about this, right? I'm reading now from the very end of the chapter, page 176 in the Shilat edition. Boa Eifel, it is clear, Sha'yois ha'seichel ha'maskal muskal echad b'mispah, since, in principle, the intellect, the intellectualizer, and the act of intellectualization, echad b'mispah, are one in number, einu l'gabi ha'boy levad. There's not respect to God. L'gabi kol seichel, with respect to every intellect. Gam banu ha'maskil ha'seichel ha'muskal ha'davar echad. Also, to us, for us, for man too. The hamaskil, haseichel, muskal, they're also one. Kasher yeshtadol seichel b'foya, when we're actively thinking. In other words, sometimes we're not thinking, sometimes we're sleeping. And then our intellect is only in potential. But the fact is that this description of the unity of the maskil, the muskal, and the seichel is not only a property of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a property of man too. It's a property of man too. And should you say, maybe there's a difference between what's called seichel and what's called yediyah, right? Even though I don't, right? It's only yediyah. Nonetheless, the Rambam, right? The Rambam does say at the end of chapter 69, he lists several things that are one with God, right? And the Rambam says, right? The Rambam says that, right? Ein ritzon v'cheptzoi v'chachmasa devam shem chutz l'atzmusai. His chayfetz, desire, his chachma are not things that are outside of his essence, right? But rather, right? They're things that are one with him, and one of them is, and he speaks here. Ritzoinai and Chachmasar are one with his Atzmos. And I would imagine you did the same thing as his Chachma. In other words, it's very hard to meet in other words, in any case, the fact is that the Rambam says, to say that God's intellect is the same for him, is something that we can understand. But I mean, he says it's about Seichel, I imagine you understand Yediyah too. Now, what's interesting is that in Perek Chav, in the third chag of the Moreh Nevuchim, he doesn't say this. God, with respect to, in other words, the Rambam in chapter 20 of section 3 lists the differences between God's knowledge and our knowledge, l'das kol ben Torah. I'm on the bottom of page 490 in the Schwartz edition. Reishis, says the Rambam, right? One knowledge, God's knowledge is on many, many things. One knowledge of God is on many things. Second, says the Rambam, right? Rambam's knowledge even goes on things that will never happen. Shlish is the third, right? God's knowledge is even on infinite. Levi is the fourth, right? God's knowledge doesn't change. You can't say you know something now and didn't know before that. Right? Okay? Fifth is the Rambam. Right? In other words, it can't be two possibilities. Now, how come he should have listed the difference that he and his knowledge are one and the same? He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that. No, clearly in the Moreh Nevuchim, the guy perplexed, this notion that God's knowledge, the act, the knower, and the object of knowledge, and the act of knowing are one, is not in the Moreh Nevuchim, is not listed in the 5 things that separates God's knowledge from man's knowledge. Right? Okay? On the contrary, in chapter 68 of the first chaylik, the first section, God says that what God and man have in common, at least when man is knowing something actively, is that they're all three are one and the same. Whereas, in the Yesodei Torah, the reason we're incapable of understanding God's knowledge, which is at one with him, is because the knower, the object of knowledge, the act of knowing are one and the same. I find this to be an incredible contradiction between the Yesodei Torah, actually, and actually Hilchos Tshuva, because Hilchos Tshuva sends you to Yesodei Torah, and at the end the Rambam says, "Daficha," therefore, the knower, the act of knowledge, the act of knowing are one and one, and we can understand this. But in fact, actually, that's what we could understand. In fact, the Rambam proves it in chapter 68. Now, you could say a teilutz, an answer, by saying is that which the Rambam says that the knower and the act of knowledge, the act of knowing are one and the same in man. That's only when man is actively in the act of knowledge, when he's awake. When he's sleeping or he's not in the act of knowing, then that's not true. But that's hard to say like that, because at the end, when a person is knowing something, he's actually knowing something, he knows what God knows. So, it would seem to me that the Rambam, and it's interesting, the Rambam doesn't really address the question of the distinction, of the contradiction between free will and knowledge in the Moreh Nevuchim. Not really. In which case, what? It would seem to me that the Rambam defined God's knowledge in this way, say the Tag, in order to address the question of Hilchos Tshuva, because he's speaking about man's free will. And the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam doesn't really directly speak about man's free will. Doesn't devote any chapter to man's free will. I mean, he speaks about that, right? And therefore, because of that, he was able to speak about this unity of knowledge which is in common both to man and to God. That's what I want to perhaps propose. Actually, the matter is more complicated than this, but we're going to have to leave that for Mr. for next week. In any case, from an undisclosed location in Yerushalayim, Kodesh, have a nice week. We'll see you Mitzvah Shem in a week. Be well.